Hey, welcome back to the next section of Q-SYS network training. We're going to be learning about isolated AV networks, which is sometimes an approach that IT and AV teams take. Rather than running all the AV on the same network as the corporate network or the campus network, they actually have a separate network for AV traffic. Let's talk about why you might want to do that, why you might not want to do that, and the way you might actually approach that. Okay? So with isolated AV networks, one reason you might want to do that is you can say with the AV integrator, okay, we, the IT team, we're responsible for our internal network, and the AV network, that's something that falls under the AV integrator. Just like in the past, if you were adding in AV infrastructure, for example, you're adding in a big matrix switcher and SDI cables, things like that, that would definitely be an AV thing. Even though we're now using networks to deliver that same traffic, it's still going to fall under the AV integrator. Maybe it's also a good idea because you don't need to make any changes on your enterprise network. Maybe it's something that's been existing for a little while. You've built this network a while ago. It wasn't really set up with AV in mind, and you could maybe change it, but maybe it's just easier to say, no, we'll build a separate one. And also, you can still monitor and manage Q-SYS and actually that network from a separate network. We'll have a look at how you can do this. Why might you not want to do this? Well, it is going to mean a little bit more complexity. And it says here greater network complexity. It doesn't necessarily mean that the network itself is going to be more complex. It's more that you're going to have two networks. Okay? You're going to have your internal network and you're going to have a separate AV network. And also, I know that some internal IT teams don't like to have a mix of switch manufacturers, even if those are on separate networks. You might say, well, look, if it's in our building, it needs to be this manufacturer or something like that. That's maybe not going to be the case if you leave it up to the AV integrator. And if you say, well, actually, you need to make sure you use our switches, well, maybe it's something that you could just do internally instead. So the point I'm trying to make here is this isn't necessarily a better or worse approach to take. It's something that you need to decide with your AV integrator, with the IT department, and really talk about it and decide what's best. Now, let's have a look at the kind of systems we're putting together here. So here we've got our enterprise network, okay? We've got our management and corporate services here. We've got routers, core switches, firewalls, internet. I can't believe I just said router in an American accent, but I think we can just go with that. And then we've got over here the AV network, which is completely separate, and it could be something really, really simple, okay? It could be just a switch, a Q-SYS core, and some Q-SYS peripherals, and maybe that's one room. Okay? Maybe then you just have lots of little networks for multiple rooms. Now, let's talk about how we can actually ensure we still have visibility of this, even though it's in an isolated network. Now, all the Q-SYS cores have multiple LAN connections. Even the smallest Q-SYS core, like the one you see here, this is the core Nano, you can see it's got something called LAN A and LAN B. And this one, this bigger one, which is actually a Dell server that runs the Q-SYS OS, this is called the core 610. This also has LAN A and B. It also has two other connections which are called auxiliary LANs. All right? The point is, even the smallest cores have two network connections. And this means you can run everything on LAN A if you want. LAN A is capable of doing all the protocols that Q-SYS can do all at once on that port if you want to do that. And that's the simplest from a kind of configuration perspective. But it may be that you want to take certain things and put them on LAN B. And then you have the auxiliary LANs, which are for non-real-time media traffic. So maybe that's for control, internet, maybe VoIP traffic, that sort of thing. Okay, so this is the way you would typically set that up. LAN A, if you're going to have AV and non-AV traffic, you would have LAN A be your AV one that's going to be on the isolated network. So that's where you're going to have your AV, your QLAN, your Dante, your PTP, QDP, video, all that stuff is going to be on LAN A. And LAN B over here, that maybe is going to be used for internet, for Q-SYS Reflect, for VoIP, maybe SNMP if you want to do some local monitoring of stuff. So that's how you're going to probably set that up. So coming back to our diagram here, we've got the enterprise network, we've got the local AV network. And what we're going to do here is essentially use LAN B and hook that up to our corporate network. Okay, simple as that. That's going to allow us to monitor the core, which in turn is going to allow us to monitor the peripherals. And of course, we can use that with Q-SYS Reflect because this is going out to the internet. Now, let's talk just a little bit about our switch here, okay? This could be any decent gigabit switch that allows for configuration, okay? We don't really discriminate very much in terms of switch brands, but actually the one in this example is one of our NS series switches, and there's no special prizes for guessing what NS stands for. These are pre-configured network switches because if you're setting up a pretty simple system like the one you just saw there, it might be that you're quite happy just not having to worry too much about the switch configuration. And what we've done here is we've worked with Netgear. So Netgear, if you haven't noticed over the past few years, absolutely fantastic in terms of supporting the AV market. Okay, they've got dedicated AV switch hardware which supports things like PoE++ and has built-in configurations for certain types of traffic. And their support team and design team have people who work dedicated on AV systems. Now, of course, at Q-SYS, we've been doing audio and video over IP for a very long time. Audio particularly, I think fair to say we've been doing that for longer than most other manufacturers. So what we've done here is we've worked together. These are using Netgear hardware, but it's using a completely custom configuration made by the Q-SYS product development team, which basically means it's entirely plug and play. The only change you might need to make if you have multiple switches is giving them unique IP addresses. But it's going to support audio, video, Dante, VoIP, control traffic, even things like AES-67, which is a third-party operability standard for audio. All of that's going to work at the same time without you having to do any configuration. So that's a good option to use for these isolated AV networks. Now, let's come back to our diagram again. Maybe we've got something like this. So we've got our corporate network, but we've got quite a few different connections here. And let's just take a look closer at these connections. You see that each switch also has a connection that says OOB. Now that means OOB. Not really. That stands for out of band. Okay, so that's kind of like LAN B on your Q-SYS core. Just like on the Q-SYS core, where LAN A and LAN B, they're not switched, they're not connected internally, other than through the kind of application layer, through the operating system. This is very much the same kind of thing. The out-of-band port lets you configure the switch, make changes to the switch config through a network connection, but that network connection is not part of the switch's network, right? It's not switched with the AV traffic that's on that switch. I said the word switch a lot of times there, but let's just, go with that. So this basically means if you combine it with LAN B that you've got on the cores, now you've got the ability to fully control the network from your corporate network if you want to make changes to it. And also you can monitor and manage all of these Q-SYS systems. They can all report up to Q-SYS Reflect, and you can have them all aggregated there. Very, very simple. Now, while we're connecting our LAN B of our cores to our corporate network, it's important to note that we can turn off any protocols that we want that we don't actually want to have on our corporate network, okay? And for this, we're going to use our network services page. So again, this is just a screenshot of a page running on the Q-SYS core on its web user interface. And you can see here that we're listing out a bunch of the different services used by Q-SYS here. So we're talking, for example, about discovery, Q-SYS designer communications, redundancy, all these different kinds of protocols. And by default, they all work on LAN A and LAN B. But you can come in and you can say, well, actually, LAN B is now connected to our corporate network. I don't really want the corporate network getting hit with all of this Q-SYS discovery protocol traffic. People are asking me what that's all about. And now my printer doesn't work. So we can just come in here, we can say we don't want to have Q-SYS discovery on LAN B. Simple as that. Okay, now what we're going to do is just have a quick summary of everything that we've learned so far. So firstly, going back to the section on prioritization, remember to apply quality of service correctly, you want to be prioritizing clock, audio, and video to guarantee the delivery on the network. Remember to use IGMP snooping to manage your multicast. Okay? Make sure you're not flooding devices and make sure you're not blocking devices that need multicast from getting it. When we talk about bandwidth, really do consider your uplink bandwidth for audio and for video, particularly for video. And one last thing, which isn't really about technology, it's more about people. When you're working on these systems, we really need to make sure we have really effective communication between the IT department and with the AV department or the AV integrator. Sometimes I've seen in the past where this has happened, but at quite a late stage, and then there's a bit of a scramble to implement a few changes or do things before the install starts happening. And really, we don't want this to be happening while we're plugging stuff into the network. This is something that we can do at the design stage, talk between the IT and the AV departments, make sure we're all on the same page, and as we've just seen in this section, start to make some of those decisions about isolating parts of the network or just running everything on the corporate network along with the other traffic. Now, before you go, make sure you take a look at the link below, which is all about our Q-SYS online help. So you've seen this earlier when we talked about Q-SYS Reflect, but this doesn't just cover Q-SYS networking. This is actually everything to do with Q-SYS, whether you're designing, programming, installing, or working with Q-SYS networking. So feel free to have a look around, but it has details on all sorts of different protocols, everything in Q-SYS, stuff that we haven't actually talked about. It talks about layer 3, it talks about routing, and it's important to understand that all of Q-SYS can be routed. The video, the discovery, all of that can go through layer 3 if you have a particularly large network. Talks more about security and other AV protocols like, for example, Dante. Just want to say thanks very much for coming to this first section on Q-SYS networking. My name's been James Martin, and good luck out there designing your Q-SYS networks. Thanks very much.